As the BBC comes under pressure over its editorial standards, the inquiry into the behaviour of the written media under Lord Justice Leveson is preparing to publish its report. There are loud voices calling for tougher, more independent regulation of the press, enforced by law. It might not surprise you to hear that it's a very unpopular idea with newspaper editors, many of whom were meeting at their annual conference in Belfast today. The actor and campaigner Hugh Grant told this programme the industry was fighting, quote, a vicious rearguard action. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis reports from Belfast.
Just weeks before the opening, the Europa experienced its first bomb.
The Europa Belfast, once famously the most bombed hotel in Europe and an old favourite with the press pack. They gathered here once again today, contemplating the troubles of their broadcasting peers, but mostly looking nervously ahead at the world after Leveson, and wondering just how much collateral damage they face when his report into press standards is finally launched.
Very apprehensive. I think the signals that I'm hearing from Parliament and from elsewhere aren't good.
The signals they're worried about are of a media landscape where, in the wake of the hacking scandal, Lord Justice Leveson recommends the press be stripped of their long-held right to regulate themselves. Just look at the BBC, some said today, an example of a regulatory framework defined by the state.
As you see with the BBC, politicians piling in from absolutely every direction to say not just who should be in charge of what, but how story A or story B should have been handled. That's natural because the BBC is in that relationship, but it's also becoming too natural for politicians to pile in and say how the press should have covered this or not covered that, and whether they were getting a fair deal or not.
Fighting for freedom of expression has been a potent theme in print in recent weeks. The campaigning has been high-octane on both sides of this increasingly heated argument. One academic called the sight of some newspaper barons wrapping themselves in the flag of liberty as repulsive as it is amusing. That was this man on the left with glasses, Professor Brian Cathcart, a leading figure in the Hacked Off campaign, who, along with the likes of Hugh Grant, Max Mosley and a collection of journalists, lawyers and political activists, believe a new independent regulator of the press must be established by the state.
When I first thought of journalism as a career, I thought, here's an industry in terminal decline. It's got a crap pay, poor prospects, got a high rate of alcoholism and suicide. That's a job for me. Yeah, that's a peppy job right there. I'll have me some of that. But no, I did attach some.
In London recently, some of Hacked Off's leading figures came to see erstwhile Daily Star reporter Richard Pepiat turn on his old industry in acerbic fashion. In his one-man show, One Rogue Reporter, amidst the bawdy humour, there was a serious note on press regulation.
Well, you have to have some sort of statute involved in a regulatory system. Otherwise, everyone knows the sheriff in town's got a plastic gun.
Hacked Off's campaigners were described by the former News of the World executive Neil Wallace recently as an unsavoury alliance. But they know how to hit back.
It is only a few press barons and editors who've enjoyed the high life for 40 years, making considerable amounts of money and wielding extraordinary influence over our elected officials, who are fighting a vicious rearguard action to hang on to the orgy they've enjoyed for 49 years. And the propaganda coming out is really laughable. I mean, again and again and again, they'll caricature people like Rich or myself or Hacked Off as wanting state regulation of the press, and emphatically we do not want state regulation of the press.
They're talking instead about a new system backed or underpinned, as they put it, by legislation. There's been a great deal of discussion here today about the calls for a new independent regulator underpinned by statute, such as we've heard from groups like Hacked Off. Much discussion because that phrase, underpinned by statute, is critical in this respect. Unlike the present system, it would compel, by law, newspaper publishers to play by the rules set by the regulator. No opting out this time. That would address the so-called Desmond problem. Richard Desmond, owner of the Express titles, who effectively just walked away from the current watchdog, the Press Complaints Commission. The industry, for its part, thinks it has the answer too, with its proposal for a new, much tougher self-regulator, more independent, more powers to investigate and issue fines, with all newspaper titles asked to sign up to a binding 5-year commercial contract. But the question they still seem to struggle to answer is what happens if a newspaper title just doesn't sign that contract. What if a newspaper proprietor just decides he doesn't want to sign the contract? You can't force him, can you?
We understand that all publishers will sign the contract.
That's not my. To be fair, that's not my question. What if that may be your understanding, but what if someone changes their mind between now and this new body you're representing is established, and they don't want to sign up?
Well, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We actually want to get on with this. We want to put a regulator into place so that publishers can actually get on and sign the contract.
Lord Justice Leveson may now just be running the spell check on his long-awaited report. But how the Prime Minister chooses to respond to that report remains the focus of much debate here in Belfast as well as Westminster. The campaigning is far from over.
Andy Davis there in Belfast. Well, let's return to our panel, and let me start again with you, Lionel Barber. When you hear talk of regulation, regulating the free press, you run an international newspaper. Does that scare you?
I have grave misgivings about regulation, not statutory regulation, that is. You have to remember that there is a whole body of law which governs the newspaper industry in the sense of libel law, confidentiality law, criminal law. Those laws, in other words, that were broken by journalists at the News of the World in the phone hacking scandal. We have to abide by the law. That was the problem, largely, which had to be addressed. And I don't believe that the news... We'll have to see what Lord Justice Leveson produces. Maybe he'll produce a rabbit out of his hat, but I'm not... so we wait, but I have misgivings.
Just one more quick question to you. You were once mentioned as a possible applicant for Director General of the BBC in the last round, which resulted in George Entwistle getting the job. You still interested?
I didn't say I was interested in the first place, and as you rightly said, I did not apply, nor was I interviewed.
Would you want the job now?
And I'm looking forward. Next year, the Financial Times actually celebrates 125 years anniversary of its first publication, and I'm very committed to FT journalism.
Thank you very much. John Tusa, so here we are rowing about regulation for the print media, more regulation for the BBC, internal, possibly external. Where's the right balance between freedom of the press and regulation?
Well, the problem with the BBC is not regulation. The problem is, number one, editorial, major problem, and in a significant part of the editorial system. And number two, it is also managerial. And the BBC needs to sort those things out. It's not actually about regulation and governance. They're sort of almost their side issues about how the Director General interacts with the chairman of the trust. But first and foremost, it's not about more regulation. And also, spare us please, whatever happens to the BBC, spare us please more volumes about compliance and what people have to do. All the BBC has to do, and this comes back to both management and editing, is to rediscover and remember why it is a public service broadcaster. There's a word which nobody uses these days, and that is values, editorial values. And somehow they've got to be remarried to the processes with which the BBC is absolutely hamstrung at the present time. But please, regulation is not the issue, editorship is.
You ran the BBC World Service for a few years. How much damage does this do to the BBC's reputation around the world, something which Lord Patton himself cares deeply about?
Yes, it'll do some, but I tell you something, and the BBC World Service has got through crises, not perhaps as bad as this, but crises before, and listeners listen. They listen to every programme. They listen to every word, they listen to every inflection, and they can see and hear for themselves what the truth is. Somebody once said, a listener once said, well, all you broadcasters, international, you're all biased, but at least we know exactly where the BBC stands. That is actually an expression of trust, and the World Service, if it loses any, will rediscover it.
Nadeem Zahawi, you've called for some limited regulation. Where do you get the balance right between freedom of the press and regulation? I mean, do you want to get Parliament more involved in the editorial process?
Well, I like Lionel Barber. I went into the Privacy and Injunctions Committee. I was part of the joint committee between the Lords and the Commons on this. Instinctively not wanting any sort of statutory underpinning or otherwise. But when I listened to the evidence, this is where I disagree with Lionel. Lionel talks about libel laws and defamation laws. That's quite right. We have those in place, and they are used by very wealthy footballers and movie stars and powerful politicians and everyone else. But nobody stands up for the McCanns, the Dowlers, the Chris Jeffreys, the ordinary people whose lives are turned upside down by rule breaking in the media, in the press. So,
but surely they will do now after the Leveson inquiry.
Well, let's wait to see what Lord Leveson comes back with. What I'm attracted to is, let's have independent regulation. So I like the Lord Hunt, Lord Black idea of giving it more investigative powers for the PCC as well as powers of reprimand. But you need to underpin it with some sort of statute that says right of appeal at a cost that is affordable for ordinary people, so that they can actually have recompense when there is wrongdoing to them that some of these very big media companies do, knowing full well they really they'll pay the fine and that's it.
Okay, that's right. We're going to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Nadeem Zahawi, John Tewson, Lionel Barber, thank you to all three of you.